It's June 8th. We're here in Lokiachokyo with Heather Stewart. Happy to have her company with such great experience as a bush pilot in Sudan, one of the first, through long periods of the war.
That's right. Okay.
Whiskey, say something in Sudanese.
Do you speak Dinka? Arabic?
No, Fur. Do you speak Fur?
No, too far away.
Huh?
We're in Lokiachokyo, approximately 35 kilometers from the Sudanese border. Is that correct, Heather?
Yeah, it's a little bit closer than that.
Yeah.
But that is approximate, yes.
And your name, we are here June 8th, I believe it is, in Trackmark Resort, which Heather's closing down, but we're happy to be her guest.
Okay, yeah. Now this is, when you say it's Trackmark Resort, it's not quite right. Trackmark was a charter company that I started, and we only closed it in December last year, and I had it for 20 years. And I started flying up here in '89. In fact, I flew in Sudan for many years. I started in '72. I was the first aircraft into Juba in southern Sudan after the first 15 years war. And then I flew from '72 till about '83, and then the war that is just the most recent war has just started then. And so I didn't fly from '83 up until '89. But in '89 I started flying into Sudan for the Catholic Fathers and for World Vision and various NGOs who wanted to come in, but they were being ambushed by road and they wanted to fly in, and nobody wanted to fly them in, so I volunteered to fly them in and got a blanket clearance with the SPLA, and I've flown since '89 up until last year here. And then we started this camp. We had another one on the other side of Lokiachokyo to start with, and we started it just as a base for our pilots, basically, and then it grew and it grew a bit bigger, and then we started having other people to make it sort of pay for itself and that sort of stuff. But yeah, the charter company was the main thing, and then the camp came later. But it was I always stress it was a working camp, not a tourist camp or a leisure camp, really. It was just for people who were working in Sudan and flying into Sudan, NGOs, the UN we used to have, and those sort of people. Yeah.
So the main purpose of the charter company was to fly into Sudan and
it was a aid and relief work, really. We would have done other flights, but no, weren't really asked to. We based ourselves here, and we flew into Sudan for a lot of different NGOs, and I even brought the UN up here to find their campsite originally. So I was one of the first people here.
So you helped them locate where the Kakuma refugee camp is now?
Well, no, but I was there when they started it, the Kakuma refugee camp, and I'm talking about the camp next door here. The UN had a big camp, about 350 people here, and we also had a big ICRC hospital. It was actually the biggest international Red Cross hospital in the world, field hospital in the world, and it was just for the wounded in Sudan and the war wounded, really. But they took a few medical cases, but not many. They took, apart from the war wounded, they took if you were bitten by a rabid dog, and if it burns, they took, and a few things like that, but otherwise only war wounded.
So the camp for 350 on the other side of Lokiachokyo that you mentioned, that was
a UN camp.
The precursor to...
No, nothing to do with... That was a camp for the UN staff and personnel who were running flights into Sudan and were living there and organising things. In 1998 and 99, we had the biggest airlift since the Berlin airlift, relief airlift in the world since the Berlin airlift. Can you imagine that? It was costing the UN about $1 million a day out of here into Sudan. So So it was a big, up-and-coming, busy place here. You wouldn't believe it now, but it was.
Well, that's fascinating.
And Kakuma, I remember when they started that camp. So yeah, that camp was started not long after, and now it's a huge refugee camp. As you must know because you've just been to see it.
Well, we found out about your close connection to Sudan by inquiring about Whiskey the dog here, and understand that she is in fact a Sudanese refugee.
She is indeed. She actually belonged to an organisation called MSF France, and they're not really allowed to have animals, but they had this dog that they sort of adopted, and the dog had puppies, and she was one of the puppies. And she was so nice, they decided to keep her. But then they were told they shouldn't have the dog, so twice they gave it away, and they gave it away to people who live 50 miles away. And each time the dog took about 5 days and came back, only aged about 4 months old. And then they had a what they call a level 4 there. It was, they had to be evacuated out because there was fighting nearby. So when the Buffalo aircraft came in to get them, it was going down the runway, and this dog was running along beside them. And so they stopped the aircraft, put the dog in, and brought it to me, because I had seen it many times when I went up and was doing flights for them, and they'd gone in and said, if you ever want to get rid of this dog, I would like it. So that's how she came to be here. Yeah.
Could you just tell us about some of the other most memorable moments? I'm sure that you have.
Oh, there's been many, many, many. Yeah. But it's quite difficult when you're just asked suddenly to remember. But I've been stuck in Sudan, and I've been, it's just been, oh God, I got my PPL in 1965. I got my commercial license in 1969. And I started flying, I did my first flight into southern Sudan in 72. But I was a bush pilot for all those years, up until last year. And Sudan was just one of the places I flew in the beginning. And then the last 20 years of my flying, it was all concentrated on Sudan. And that was basically because during the war, the missionaries and the NGOs wanted somebody to fly here. Nobody else wanted to fly here because it was conceived to be dangerous. But actually, it wasn't really dangerous because we had very good information about where the fighting was, and we got complete permission for everywhere we went and all that. So in the beginning, for the first 3 years, I was the only person flying up here, except for one other ex-Vietnam pilot who was my only competition. But they had the MiGs flying, and they had the Antonovs flying, and the Antonov bombers. So I used to take off from here or from Lodwa at about 4 o'clock in the morning, fly when it was dark, land at dawn, camouflage the aircraft, and take off the next morning in the dark again with somebody at the end of a runway, with usually a priest at the end of the runway with a solar lamp, line up with it, and off I go. And I did that for 3 years before anybody else started flying here.
So we were just coming from Kakuma, and on Saturday we were able to see off a convoy of 71 Sudanese refugees being repatriated.
Oh really? Did they want to go back?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
Well, that's good to know.
And this voluntary repatriation, and that was a question, and I think it was summed up by a small little boy who was not being repatriated, and we said, how do you feel about this? And he says, I want to go home.
Yeah.
And although a home he might not know, that must be the sentiment in his family. So we see that it's affecting Lokia Chokyo. Could you tell us how the 2005 peace agreement and what you've seen happening since then in Lokia Chokyo in relation to Sudan?
Well, before the peace agreement, Lockheed there was a lot of people here, a lot of UN, International Red Cross, a lot of NGOs, a lot of missionaries. But after the peace agreement, slowly, over the last 2 years, 3 years, isn't it? Not even more now, my goodness, the time's gone, yeah. They've gone slowly back. So now, Lockheed really is not needed anymore. And because most people go directly to Juba from Nairobi, rather than, I mean, some people do drive, and if they drive, they come through this way or sometimes through Uganda. But most people, or the expatriates anyway, mainly fly, and it's cheaper for them to fly directly from Nairobi into Juba, rather than coming via Lockheed.
Which means Juba is peaceful and safe.
Oh yeah, it's well, you know, the southern Sudan has its own set of problems, and for all sorts of reasons. Even though there's a peace agreement, there's still a lot of issues which are not resolved. So there is, you know, a certain amount of unrest and fighting, but it's safe. I think it's safe, and so people, and also the Sudanese, if these NGOs were working for them, you know, to bring them aid, they preferred them to be based in Sudan rather than in Lockheed. So that's why a lot of people have moved out, and the aircraft which before were not allowed to be based in Juba are now all based in the southern Sudan. So there's no need for Lockheed really, except as a jumping off place. You know, there are several camps in Lockheed, so and all of them are feeling the pinch because really it's gone very, very quiet here. Yes, but that's how it's affected Lockheed. But,
I have a question.
okay.
Do you have any stories about, during the war, stories of refugees coming over the border?
Oh yeah, there was well, you must know the story about all the lost boys who came in through Ethiopia and ended up at Kakuma camp.
But you were here then.
I was there then. Yeah, I was there, and I remember and I met several people who actually went with them. So that's quite interesting. You know, but you must have met the people from them in Kakuma when you were there, didn't you?
We met.
Part of the Lost Boys.
As part of the
Yes.
Lost Boys. We worked with some of the Lost Boys.
Yes.
Met with Valentino Adak
Yes.
Deng, whose story was novelized in What is the
That's
What?
what I hear. Yeah.
So you haven't read it.
No, I haven't read it. I'm ashamed to say. But yeah, but we had a lot of refugees came through here during the war, and we would also bring a lot of war wounded here because of the hospital, and Kakuma really had a lot more Sudanese then. I think, as you mentioned just now, they are repatriated them now back to Sudan. Yeah. And I think a lot of them went overseas to Canada and places.
Canada, US,
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah. But they are sending quite a few back now. But what's sad is they're not really going back to very much better conditions than when they came out. Apart from the fact that the war is over, you know, they still don't have anything yet, and they haven't got organised with really sort of building, growing and manufacturing their own food and all that stuff. So,
When was the first time that you were in Sudan?
New Year 1972.
In what part?
It was just after the first 15 years war, and I was asked to do a charter in a small aircraft up to Juba from Nairobi. It was a 10-day charter, and it went from Nairobi to Juba, and then we spent a night in Juba, and Juba to Bor to Malakal, where we went on the governor's barge down the Nile with my clients who were actually hunters. They were hunting on a hunting safari, and then after that we went from Malakal to Wau, where they were just building a leprosy hospital there. And there was a Frenchman and a German who I used to fly very often after that. We were building this big hospital for leprosy. And then we went from Wild to Yambio, and Yambio then back to Juba. But in those days it was very different. We didn't have any GPS, we didn't have any HF radio, we didn't have any radar, we didn't have any of those things that we have today that helps us fly around Sudan.
So, can you compare the Sudan of those times to a more recent Sudan? You said you were flying into recently.
Yes, I was up until last year. I was flying every day into southern Sudan. Well, from 73 to 83, there was no war, but it was not a very peaceful place. But it was a lot better actually than it still is today, because then they had infrastructure. In places like Yambio, they'd have missions, they would have a school, they would have a church, they would have shops where you could buy stuff. But then once the war started in 83 up until 88 or whatever it was. Was it 83 it started? Yes, it was. Up until 88, yes, 88, 89. After that then, and all through that time that I was flying there in the 90s even, they had nothing left, nothing at all. So there was very little advancement in the southern Sudan. There was no building, there was no infrastructure, nobody was growing crops, So they hadn't really progressed a great deal since I first went, to be honest.
Yes, and then on top of that, more recent fighting in the 90s. So the conditions now, as far as...
Well, after once the UN came in and they all started flying in and bringing aid and things, a lot improved, but it didn't improve that the Sudanese were able or were doing a lot for themselves. They were being given aid and everything, really was brought to them by aid. They were not able, they didn't have money, they didn't have the training, they didn't have anything really to be able to start for themselves very
anything
much.
Beyond subsistence.
Yeah. Until after the peace agreement, and then now things are getting better, I understand.
This is the view from my room, my tokal, at Trackmark. I'm standing on my veranda. It's almost dark, but I wanted to show you inside. So let's go in and take a peek at my room, my tokal. Look at how nice. I have my stuff all over the place, but check out the bed with the mosquito netting. Very comfortable, double bed, lots of pillows, tile floor. Just very, very nicely appointed. And here's my favorite part. Look at the size of this shower. It's a huge open shower. And I guess that's enough. Let's go back this way. And you can see my bed from this angle, from the bathroom. This is just one of the most beautiful places I've ever stayed in my life.